Nicola Bard. Immigrants wrongly executed. But their deaths served as a message to others.
Here's to you, Nicola and Bard. Rest forever here in our hearts. The last and final moment is yours. That agony is your triumph.
Ours is a society that murders the innocent.
Metal Gear Solid presents cinematic imagery that shows a visual presentation based around its events. The series often shows a wide contrast of emotions they so often provoke, from its characters to the environment, but layered behind its themes and gameplay are musical scores that blend between these elements and act as an essential gateway into the auditory senses that resonate and heighten the experience, whatever the genre may be, or the message that the said media may be trying to convey. Metal Gear Solid often presents this in a masterful way, very similar to an orchestra playing a melancholic story through sound rather than sight. And it's fair to say that Metal Gear Solid seamlessly blends the two. Ground Zeroes, the prologue to the Phantom Pain, which in reality is pretty much connected as one game, opens up with a very intense scene. Visually it's cold and dark and destructive. It rains with flashes of lightning, very fitting in the context of the narrative and cohesively fitting. It opens with a low mechanical military rhythm, a pulse that feels less like music and a lot more like a countdown. The ambience primes the player with a sense that something grim and inevitable is about to unfold. And just as Skullface leaves Chico with a Walkman, that all too iconic song, Here's to You, starts to play, albeit just underneath Big Boss and Kaz planning how they're going to infiltrate and extract Chico and Paz. Just as it switches back to Skullface with a visually epic scene, something ripped out of a Quentin Tarantino movie. It's a song widely loved by the fandom amongst many others in the series. Just like this song, they have a particular meaning and placement intentional to the series. They're simply not just feel-good songs as we often see within video games. Each is a symphony that sums up the game's message. Joan Baez wrote the lyrics to Here's to You, with the music composed by Ennio Morricone, specifically for Giuliano Maltonado's 1971's film Sacco and Vanzetti. For Baez, who was deeply involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s. Sacco and Vanzetti were a part of a wave of Italian immigrant anarchists in the early 20th century. They weren't criminals in the conventional sense, but they were workers and poor men who laboured in shoe factories and fish markets. But they believed in a political philosophy that, like many others at the time, was already marked as dangerous in America: anarchism. Their deaths served as a message, or rather a warning, about how easily societies sacrifice truth because of fear, and how the state can turn immigrants, outsiders, or dissenters into martyrs. The song itself is striking in its simplicity. Just one verse repeated like a chant, more like a hymn than a protest anthem, almost as if it was meant to be carved into memory for good. Their ideals and ideologies, as reported and preserved through their writings and speeches, centered around a rejection of state power, capitalism to be more specific, and militarism. They believed the state served the interest of the rich and powerful, while ordinary workers lived and died exploited. They opposed war, particularly World War I, which the United States had just fought, and they refused to serve when conscription was enforced. To the government and to mainstream society at that time, this refusal to fight made them appear unpatriotic and like traitors, all in a time when patriotism was measured by your willingness to die for the flag. And this is something we see in history continue all the way up to the likes of the Vietnam War, with prominent figures like Muhammad Ali rejecting war and in turn receiving prison time for his ideals and beliefs.
You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
To see the connection with the MGS series, we have to go back in May 1920. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested in connection with a payroll robbery and double homicide in Braintree, Massachusetts, involving roughly about $15,000, and of course 2 murdered men. A year later, they were convicted based primarily on circumstantial evidence, relying heavily on what the authorities called conscience of guilt. Despite appeals and widespread doubt about the evidence, their requests for retrial were repeatedly denied, and they were sentenced to death in April 1927. Their execution was carried on to August 23, 1927 at Charlestown State Prison. Webster Thayer, the judge on this case, was notoriously biased against anarchists. Contemporaries reported that Thayer, speaking about Sacco and Vanzetti outside of the courtroom, said with the words to the effect of, and I quote, "Did you see what I did with those anarchist bastards? That ought to hold them for a while. And also, regardless of the evidence, they ought to hang anyway." Those remarks circulated widely and fueled the outrage around the case, because they made it clear that Thayer never cared about whether Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty or innocent. The trial was less about justice than about sending a message to those so-called radicals, and reassuring the frightened public that the state was in control. This is exactly the sentiment Kojima latches on with MGS in the series, and particularly with Skullface. When Skullface talks about how Nicola and Bart's death served as a message to others, he is channeling the same philosophy as Thayer. Justice as theatre, punishment as propaganda. Guilt is irrelevant. It's the machinery of power and those who wield it. Saying it doesn't matter what you did, you are what we say you are, and we'll destroy you to prove it is the sentiment. Ultimately, their execution did become a symbol of injustice, a warning that, as many saw it, ours is a society that murders the innocent.
Your favorite song. Nicola, Bart, immigrants wrongly executed. But their death served as a message to others. That ours is a society that murders the innocent. Do you too believe your sacrifice will change the world? If so, the time is now.
The Sacco and Vanzetti reference, predominantly shown in Ground Zero, spans the series and its characters in a big way. Skullface and Big Boss, in many ways, connect together symbolically in their shared connection to this theme. They are anarchists. They themselves, in their own way, are a movement that seeks to abolish all institutions that perpetuate authority, coercion, and hierarchy, primarily targeting the state and capitalism. Any ruling governing body is a target.
We will forsake our countries. We will leave our motherlands behind us and become one with this earth. We have no nation, no philosophy, no ideology. We go where we're needed, fighting not for country, not for government, but for ourselves.
With this, I rid the world of infestation. All men will breathe free again, reclaim their past, present, and future. This is no ethnic cleanser. It is a liberator to free the world from zero. Let the world be.
In essence, characters like Big Boss advocates for the replacement of the state with stateless societies and voluntary free associations, but not through peaceful protest, but rather fighting back with their own authority, with guns, and becoming institutions themselves. What Big Boss and his unit are fighting for is a form of liberation. It's not about ideologies for them per se, but their line of work as a business has attracted a lot of attention that other systems deem a threat. The location is of huge importance in relation to this theme, Camp Omega, which is symbolic in a reflection of Guantanamo, or known as Camp X-Ray. It's a symbolic continuation of the same history that Here's to You memorializes. Sacco and Vanzetti were not primarily feared for the crime they were accused of, but for what they represented in ideals. Anarchist immigrants in a climate of xenophobia and Red Scare paranoia, fueled by anti-communism and paranoia in the United States, particularly prominent after World War I and after following World War II, during the Cold War brewing between the Soviets and the US. Their trial became less about proving whenever they killed too many in Braintree and more about stamping out a perceived ideological threat to the United States. Their political beliefs were treated as evidence of guilt or rather treason. They were considered traitors not for pledging their loyalties to the US, which didn't really give them a choice as their deaths showcased. This mirrors Skullface's interrogations of both Paz and Chico, who serve as Sacco and Vanzetti, who in turn act as real POWs subjected to ruthless, inhumane torture methods in order to extract important information or rather indoctrinate through fear. In an essence, just like Sacco and Vanzetti, Paz and Chico are not given a fair trial, but rather subjected to torture, mostly for information that's beneficial to Skullface, but just as reports have shown in the political prisoner of war camp Guantanamo, this mirrors the inhumane treatment of all enemy combatants around the world. Skullface calls Chico a traitor, and in the same right, Paz, whose ideologies changed and aligned with anarchism ideologies tied to Big Boss.
Snake and his men may be without a nation, but they are still an army, and that means sometimes they have to fight the bad guys. Of course, they should not fight at all. It is obvious to me that any problem can be solved with reasonable discussion. Maybe Snake and the others think so too, because the idea is to set aside war for one day a year and relax in peace.
But as for Paz, after once serving for Cypher, an organisation that is the complete opposite, she is in a way used as a pawn by every side. Cypher, Skullface, and even indirectly by MSF. She is a victim of governing ideologies, one that sadly doesn't align with a capitalistic Cypher organisation that is primarily based in the US. She is a threat to that very organisation. She becomes a victim.
You shall not see triumph. You've been most helpful, and I have one last use for you. To you I give a magnificent end, but an end nonetheless. The final moment is yours.
She seemingly becomes a martyr in a way, just like Sacco and Vanzetti, with a fate of execution similar to their demise. Skullface plays the role of both the judge and the executioner. He ultimately decides Paz's guilt unilaterally, labelling her as a traitor and a tool of Cypher, nothing more, then tortures her without trial, then condemns her to die by planting the bomb. He isn't interested in the truth, he's interested in making an example, just as Judge Thayer. Her death becomes a message to others who think they might be able to change the world, the same way Thayer wanted Sacco and Vanzetti to be a warning to other anarchists. Just as Skullface did to Cypher by getting to Big Boss, their death serves as a message to others. There's power in the context. This is exactly what Kojima used in the context of MGS5's narrative, which branches out into several thematic points of history throughout the series, not just MGS5. It reinforces the idea that heroes internally may be heroes, but to the outside world they can be perceived as villains. Guantanamo Bay, particularly in the post-9/11 era, operates on a disturbingly similar premise. Many detainees have been imprisoned there without trial for years, or given unfair trials such as Sacco and Vanzetti. Some were eventually released, of course, without charges after being deemed no threat at all, but during their confinement they were branded as terrorists or enemy combatants, labels that in the public eye erase the need for evidence, but the placement of this camp itself all serves and ties in with the symbology here. Guantanamo Bay has been deliberately positioned to operate outside of normal US legal jurisdiction in a way that skirts the protections of the Geneva Conventions, which is mentioned throughout the dialogue between Kaz and Big Boss.
Snake, you can forget about civil liberties where you're headed. God only knows what they'd do to you if you got caught. Do not let that happen. The Cubans leased the land to the US as a gesture for helping them gain independence from Spain. The deal remains in effect until both countries agree to dissolve it, or the US abandons the land. That's why America still operates the base even after La Revolucion. Problem is, it's leased land.
Meaning it isn't American soil, so the US Constitution doesn't apply there. That allows them to withhold its civil rights protections.
Yeah, that's Uncle Sam's excuse. The area was originally only for detaining refugees from countries like Cuba and Haiti. But a few years ago, the CIA and its like started using it as a black site. Enemies of the state are renditioned there and subjected to extreme forms of interrogation. You can bet Cypher had a hand in that. As you'd expect, American and other Western human rights organizations aren't allowed anywhere near the place. What happens there disappears down the memory hole.
Who knows what they're doing to Chico and Paz?
I'd like to interrogate her ourselves, but if worst comes to worst, make sure she's dead. Chico, on the other hand, we have to bring back, fast. He knows too much about us.
Cos?
The area is surrounded by mines placed by both the US and Cuba, making escape on foot impossible. You're heading into the Lion's Den, Snake. Don't take this one lightly.
It's a site technically outside of the law. Outside oversight where people like Paz are labelled enemies and tortured or executed based on suspicion alone, along with other POWs. It's the same mechanism that condemned Sacco and Vanzetti in the 1920s. They are considered enemy combatants, rather than prisoners of war, or maybe even victims. The public buys the cover stories because of the level of indoctrination the party has over its collective through fear and control is, as Orwell's 1984 suggests, a hive mind, a prominent piece of media which acts as subtext within the main context of MGS5's narrative. That beliefs are often moulded throughout many ways, through times and ages.
People need an appropriate context for their lives. A context that's stimulating without being destructive.
Just as in the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, the accusation in the conviction, once you are pretty much categorised as a threat to national security, the details no longer matter. You're guilty without much evidence needed. And the US isn't just guilty of this, but sometimes power is just a means to an end. The Patriots, or once Cypher, who predominantly rule over the US, act as the party as they're known in Orwell's 1984. Their power extends over its people to ensure obedience is maintained, and everyone thinks collectively.
Clearly an AI couldn't be allowed to make its own decisions. So they would take away its ability to act, and instead create a specialized system in which the AI, bound by specific rules, filters the massive amounts of data it collects before passing it on to people, subtly guiding their decision-making. A system of the people, by the people, for the people. The Patriots. It's all about ensuring that the concepts driving society appears the same in the mind of each person in that society. About maintaining the identity of the individual, and yet having that individual willingly make up part of the whole. I guess it's fitting to call that patriotism. Creating a united world. Zero's will is already fading into a shadow of what it once was. Systems, guidelines, rules, laws. When you take a mentality and fix it in a solid shape, put it out there in the hands of people, it can only begin to decay. No mentality can last forever. When the body dies, the will dies with it.
Fabrication of their wrongdoings is disguised as noble and righteous, whilst discrediting and destroying anyone who threatens otherwise. Just as Solid Snake and Otacon get branded terrorists for exposing such corruptions, but once branded heroes whilst doing the bidding of the Patriots. Essentially, it shows anyone who's aligned themselves with the Patriots' views, or in real terms, the society that powers that be, that control, are less likely to come to harm than those who challenge them.
They didn't choose Snake to be a hero. so they decided to do a smear campaign.
I think the Patriots wanted to make an example of him so everybody would think twice before opposing them.
If the times demand it, we'll be revolutionaries, criminals, terrorists.
Interestingly, Skullface, the complex antagonist, takes control of the scene in Ground Zeroes, almost acting as the ghostly, cynical narrator of injustice that's not meant to exist, charting the player's course through mysterious tapes almost as a manifesto of societal biases and the delusion it causes. By invoking Sacco and Vanzetti, he's framing himself as the voice of the wronged. Even if he tortures and murders Pats, he aligns himself with victims whilst also creating new ones, perpetuating the same cruelty he claims to despise by metaphorically making the powers that be taste their own medicine. He is a product of what they have created. Essentially, he becomes everything that he despises. MGS5 uses Sacco and Vanzetti to show the audience that the atrocities you see in the game are reflections of real-world injustices, and the cycle of power and violence. It's history repeating itself, something that every society faces worldwide. This is where Kojima's social critique sharpens into something universal. Societies are known to normalize beliefs that are bound by conformities, or when fear takes control, the collective naturally attacks anything that opposes their created structure, their systems that they depend on, even if they may be morally questionable, nonsensical, illogical, or just straight up cruel. Sacco and Vanzetti's America in the 1920s is a world so different from now, which was a country terrified of anarchists and immigrants, a false mindset planted into their minds, embracing xenophobia as justice. Big Boss in this right starts a country that upholds anarchist viewpoints. Having been a victim of injustice and betrayed by the country of liberty and freedom, he sees it as a society not for independence, but a front for the establishment's interests. Patriotism is just a validating word with no true meaning or importance when it's for a bad cause. He sees martyrs created in front of him. Just like the boss, he understands that in this fight to oppose it, he has to become the thing that he hates to destroy the system. As does Skullface. It's an ironic paradox. They either become a victim in the system, or they make their own system, one that operates outside of the governing law. Both Sacco and Vanzetti avoid serving in the World War due to their pacifist and anti-war beliefs, which contextually clearly mirrored Kojima's message of the true realities of warfare. Aside from flashy guns and your simple good guys and bad guys, it really was a question of our loyalties and beliefs.
I'm loyal to the end, to my purpose. What about you, Jack? What's it going to be? Loyalty to your country or loyalty to me? Your country or your old mentor? The mission or your beliefs? Your duty to your unit or your personal feelings?
Big Boss embodies the break from patriotism. He gave everything to America, fought its wars, bled on its battlefields, and then realised he was a pawn in a service of a lie. So his rebellion against the US government was against the entire idea that one should sacrifice themselves to a nation that treats soldiers and its public as disposable pieces. His rejection of patriotism echoes in Sacco and Vanzetti's refusal to serve in a war machine that they didn't believe in. They had their own war to fight, albeit in a passive way. MGS Rising excellently demonstrates this. It's not about justice in that term. Just because something is considered legal doesn't make it right. Those who wield the power to control, like the law and the police, can often use it to benefit them even if their policies and rules are destructive or unjust.
They import those brains legally, for medical purposes. It's all done.
Being legal doesn't make it right.
Raiden fights his own war rather than by proxy as before, for the benefit of mankind by protecting children and future generations from exploitation from people like World Marshal with the law in their back pockets. Like Sacco and Vanzetti, Skullface represents the outsider, the man with no nation because of the great wars that were fought. He becomes an immigrant in a foreign land, forced to be accustomed to their way of life and societies, removing his values and traditions with ideologies. By tying Skullface's past to figures like Sacco and Vanzetti, and by showing Big Boss's betrayal by his own country, it presents a cycle of societies destroying the independent thinkers, the outsiders, the nonconformists, and in process creating the very monsters they later fear. Ultimately, even if Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty of murder and committed such crime, it was still less about justice but more simply to prove a point. Prosecutors like Judge Webster Thayer, as a lot of people in those times, were indoctrinated by reactionary nationalism and were very distrustful of anything that challenged their institutions, even if they weren't a threat. As is the case of the statement made by Judge Thayer, responsible for the execution, who is quoted saying, "This man, although he may not have actually committed the crime attributed to him, is nevertheless morally culpable, because he is the enemy of our existing institutions." End quote. This reminded me of the trial of Huey Emmerich, who is considered an enemy or a traitor to Diamond Dogs. He too becomes a victim of a flawed justice system, albeit if any justice system at all, that's already pitted against him, because there was never really any conclusive evidence against him, but rather circumstantial. The only thing keeping Diamond Dogs going was revenge.
The deadliest enemy's right here in our midst. And they will get no mercy.
Aside from war as a business, once their common enemy had been defeated, and once they accomplished revenge, they started fearing traitors in their midst, just as the American public during the 1920s with anarchists, a rhetoric Miller would use to cast suspicions.
Here these days, huh?
Yeah. Every chance they get, they're telling us not to trust anyone. Commander Miller's gone a little cuckoo ever since that Skullface guy died.
All that phantom pain talk. I'd say all he's fighting is phantoms.
Well, revenge was his only reason for getting up in the morning. Then he got his revenge. And it didn't bring back anything he lost.
This is not to say Huey wasn't guilty on some accounts, such as the death of Strangelove, but that was beside the point, because her death was irrelevant to Huey's wrongdoings to Diamond Dogs.
That you locked her in that coffin.
No! She did it herself! It was suicide! And even if I did, what right do you have?
Which focuses away the trial into a different direction that's unirrelevant, just as it was for Sacco and Vanzetti, because it became more about ideology rather than these crimes. But whenever he was behind the attack on MSF or the second leak in Diamond Dogs, holds him accountable. But the trial was hypocritical, coming from a bunch of warmongers who kill for money.
Whatsoever. You say you're an army free from government. You talk big about being a nation unto yourselves. But from the outside, you're just thugs, rebels, a militia, terrorists, an unhinged threat to society. You're nothing but a bunch of psychopaths.
So you're not with us?
No, I didn't.
I thought we were on the same side. That's too bad.
Huey was nothing but a coward, one who was used and abused for others' agendas, but ultimately his ideologies didn't align with anyone at all, hence why he becomes a threat to others in a broken judicial system that doesn't really exist. But in that, Venom Snake acts as a good message to others. Instead of allowing his soldiers to revel in revenge, anger and bloodlust towards an individual in an unjust, vulnerable position with no fight in him, Venom sets the example that it's not their place to judge. That they are simply there to complete their contracts and missions, paid to enact judgments on others' behalves. It's not their place to judge an enemy.
We exist outside the law. What should we do, boss?
Us? You're right, he is not one of us. But we are not responsible to judge an enemy. He leaves Mother Base, and that'll be the end of it.
But what makes MGS5 so special is that most of the characters in MGS5 are guilty of crimes. They are goods as well as evils in many ways with all of them. or trying to justify their actions. Ultimately, judgments made in societies are often ambiguous in regards to justice, becoming subjective to many cultures and countries, or the change of the times, which is a fundamental quote that explains a world with ever-changing ideals. Originally, the song Here's to You was heard at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4's credits, with vocals by Lisbeth Scott and arranged by Harry Gregson Williams. Its placement seemed fitting when you take into account what originally Otacon and Snake's fate was going to be at the end of the game. As some of you may know, the original ending was to have Otacon and Snake turn themselves in for all the things they did during the philanthropy days. Then they would end up getting executed for their crimes. Another reflection of Sacco and Vanzetti's unjust outcome that would later get repurposed in Metal Gear Solid 5. Just like these guys, Otacon and Snake were fighting for a better world, for change, to ensure that the next generation doesn't pay for the mistakes we've made as a human race.
To keep track of the mistakes we've made as a species.
We need to remember, to spread the word, to fight for change, and that's what keeps me alive.
Even in doing a righteous thing, the original ending had them executed by a broken justice system that still today often prosecutes innocent people due to corruption. Across the board, this sums up Metal Gear Solid perfectly. That justice in this world and that world really doesn't exist, or at least it's flawed in certain aspects. People face judgments based on their own perceptions of justice, a constant cycle of tragedy that turns into revenge or resentment. But it's clear what Kojima was trying to express, but will ultimately remain to concepts and ideas. Interestingly, in Bartolomeo Vanzetti's last hearing in the courtroom statement in 1927 states, and I quote, "I have already said that I not only am not guilty, but I never commit a crime in my life. I have never stole and I have never killed. If there is a reason why I'm here, as a guilty man, it is the reason and none else. I have suffered because I was a radical, and indeed I'm a radical. I suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian." Vanzetti continued, saying, "Well, if you could execute me 2 times, I would live again to do what I've already done." And in his famous reflection via journalist Philip Strong, "If it had not been for these things, I might not have lived out my life a failure. Now we are not failure. This is our career and our triumph. The taking of our lives, the agony is our triumph." In this tragic ordeal that ultimately led to Vanzetti and Sacco's execution was only just the beginning of immortalizing their legends, their ideals, that so many felt as well. Within Vanzetti's passing, his final words were a passage to which people strive for, a world free from systematic persecution, a form of ideological liberation. His message was not for fear or control as it seemed on the surface, but rather revolution against oppressive forces. In his final letter to Defense Committee after the governor refused clemency, and I quote, "We are innocent. This is a war of plutocracy, against liberty. We die for anarchy. Long live anarchy." End quote. A sentiment at the time so many people felt within the US, a change that needed to happen. Life simply could not work in the melting pot of cultures known as the US. If it had to merge together, it would be absolute chaos if people couldn't work their ideologies out and understand each other's cultures. This sparked the balance of the scales that needed to tip the balance of power. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti sparked widespread protests and riots worldwide, because this was a big moment in history that ultimately could have affected everyone systematically from overarching political authorities, a totalitarian system, which sounds something awfully familiar that's happening in modern society. Anarchists generally reject hierarchical structures and centralised power, promoting decentralised and self-governing communities. Their death did serve as a message to others, just like Paz, who ultimately in the end wanted peace, or when Strangelove wanted to make the boss's vision of a better world alive and leaves the Patriots AI susceptible for future generations to overthrow it. And Kotalker, a Native American, a victim of these ideologies and the times of colonialism that suppressed his people. All of these are long-fought victories that these characters were trying to achieve, A lot of them didn't wish to be shaped by a system that wanted to mould them into their own design. They wished to be free to think for themselves. Of course, all of this was a long fought for these victories, to Ocelot playing the long game to destroy the patriots within, Solid Snake's determination for a brighter future, and a lot of other characters I'm sure you guys are familiar with, so leave them in the comment section if you like, that all had a part to play in shaping a future whenever they're in a coma or dead. Their ideals of liberty and freedom and the end of the war economy that plagued society in a dystopian mindset was now destroyed. War had lost all of its meaning. AI no longer controlled humanity, be it on a biological level, the ultimate form of control. People was liberated, their past, present and future was now available for them to claim. Humanity for once could be a free republic, at least for a while, because if anything life has taught us, as Anna Arendt is quoted saying, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. Which suggests that once a revolution succeeds, the revolutionary figures initially driven by radical change often transition into a more cautious established role like before. Essentially, history repeats itself because humans are clearly very good at doing that. Hideo Kojima reportedly considered focusing the narrative around Huey Emmerich in MGS5, and in these concepts Huey was central as the narrator. The story was less about soldier ideology and more about how science and morality are weaponized by a system corrupt at its core. Becomes a fuller cast like Huey Emmerich, Moral Spiral and America's corruption arc that were fully never realized or were just diminished or replaced into tapes. But the message was still clear. The narrative was more direct in this case, reflecting a critique of America's blind hypocritical systems, along with the rest of the world. The return to Camp Omega in Kojima's vision was going to explain it further, but MGS4's ending in summary with Big Boss's departure explained the will of others, and to live and think for ourselves rather than being bound to ideologies, or to try and fit in, and rather than doing what's right but to ultimately decide for ourselves. Anyway guys, with all of that being said, thanks for watching another video, and here's to you guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're new here, and turn on all notifications for more in-depth content in the future. Metal Gear Solid Delta is slowly approaching, and I can't wait to see what the game has to offer. Anyway guys, here's to you, until we meet again.
That chopper was no place for Chico to die. I'd like to at least think history won't remember his part in the revolution.
When you pick up a gun, there's always a chance you'll die for nothing. He knew that as well as the rest. Now that he's gone, it's up to the rest of us to decide what it was all worth. If we don't, there's nothing to prove that Chico ever lived at all. We're his mark on the world.